My name is Claire Whitmore. I was 29 years old when I sat across a mahogany conference table from my future mother-in-law and signed a prenuptial agreement while she smiled at her son and whispered, "Smart boy." The room had 7 people in it. A lawyer, 2 paralegals, my fiancé Daniel, his mother Eleanor, his uncle Robert, who handled the family's legal affairs, and me. 6 of them were relaxed. I had been awake since 4 a.m. The lawyer began reading the terms aloud: standard language, asset protection, inheritance clauses, the kind of document designed to make sure that if this marriage ended, Daniel Ashford walked away with everything his family had built, and I walked away with exactly what I came in with. Eleanor lifted her champagne glass before he'd finished the first page. "To protecting what matters," she said. Everyone laughed. The lawyer cleared his throat and kept reading. And that is where their mistake began. Because Eleanor had been so certain the document said what she wanted it to say, that she had never once considered it might also say something else. Before I tell you what happened when he turned to page 6, hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that conference room, you need to understand what happened in the 2 years before it. I grew up in Saginaw, Michigan. My father, Ray Whitmore, ran a small civil engineering firm out of a 2-room office above a dry cleaner on Prospect Street. He drove a 12-year-old Silverado with a cracked dashboard and a Pine Sol air freshener hanging from the mirror. He packed his own lunch every day in a blue Coleman cooler that lived behind the passenger seat. He was, by every visible measure, an ordinary man. What people didn't see was the yellow legal pad he kept in his desk drawer. Every year on my birthday, from the time I turned 8, my father would sit me down at the kitchen table, open that legal pad, and show me a number. Not a gift, not a card, a number. What he'd saved that year, what the total was, what it meant. "Money is quiet, Claire," he always said. "The people who talk about it the loudest usually have the least of it." I didn't fully understand what he meant until I met the Ashfords. Daniel and I met at a conference in Chicago when I was 27. I was presenting a structural load analysis for a hospital renovation project. He was attending for a real estate development firm his family owned. He was tall, genuinely kind, and the first person at that conference who asked me a question about my work that wasn't also a way of telling me about his. We dated for 14 months before he told his family about me. I noticed the gap. I didn't say anything about it. The first time I met Eleanor Ashford was at a dinner at their home in Grosse Pointe. 3 stories, Lakeview, a catering staff for what she described as a casual Sunday. She shook my hand at the door and looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that's been delivered to the wrong address. Polite, patient, waiting for someone to come collect it. Over dinner, she asked me twice what my father did for a living, once at the appetizer course and once at dessert, as if she hoped the answer might change. Both times I told her. Civil engineering, small firm, Saginaw. Both times she smiled and turned to ask Daniel something else. His uncle Robert was warmer, but in the way that people are warm when they're also conducting an assessment. He asked me about my firm, my salary range, my long-term plans. He nodded at everything I said with the expression of a man who had already made up his mind. On the drive home, Daniel reached over and held my hand. "They'll warm up," he said. I looked out the window at the lake. I said, "I know." I was already thinking about my father's yellow legal pad. Over the next 8 months, I kept a document on my personal laptop. I didn't call it anything dramatic. I named the file Notes, and I saved it in a folder labeled Work Admin. Inside, I kept a record, dated entries, what was said, who was present. The dinner where Eleanor told a story about Daniel's ex-girlfriend, a woman from their social circle, and looked directly at me when she reached the ending. The holiday gathering where Robert introduced me to a family friend as Daniel's current girlfriend, despite the fact that we had been engaged for 6 weeks. The afternoon, Eleanor called Daniel while I was sitting beside him and said, loud enough for me to hear, "You need to think carefully about what you're building your future on." I wrote it all down, calmly, completely, with timestamps. I want to be clear about something. I was not building a case out of anger. I was building it because my father taught me that the people who are prepared for the conversation they hope they never have to have are the ones who survive it. 3 months before the wedding, Daniel's family proposed the prenuptial agreement. Daniel came to me with it himself, uncomfortable, apologetic, holding a folder like it might bite him. "It's just a formality," he said. "For the family's assets. It doesn't reflect how I feel." I took the folder. I read every page. Then I made a phone call. Her name was Patricia Hale. 44 years old, family law attorney, 17 years of practice, an office on the 4th floor of a glass building downtown that smelled like coffee and eucalyptus. I came to her with the Ashford prenup, my notes document, and a manila envelope my father had given me the previous Christmas, pressed into my hands in the driveway after dinner while my mother was loading the dishwasher. "For when you need it," he'd said. Inside the envelope was a summary from his accountant. The Whitmore Family Revocable Trust, established 16 years ago. My name listed as sole beneficiary. Current value, $3.8 million. The dry cleaner office, the Coleman cooler, the 12-year-old Silverado. My father had been quiet for 30 years. Patricia sat across from me, read every document, and set them in 3 separate piles on her desk. "The Ashford prenup protects their assets," she said, "which is legitimate. What it does not do is account for yours." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Did they ask for a financial disclosure from you?" "They had not." "Then they drafted this assuming you had nothing." She tapped the Ashford document. "That is a significant oversight." We met 4 times over the following 6 weeks. Patricia made amendments to the prenup. Careful, legal, fully enforceable amendments that addressed 3 things. First, a full mutual asset disclosure addendum. My trust, my investment portfolio, the property my father had transferred into my name 4 years prior, all of it documented, all of it protected under the same structure the Ashfords had used for Daniel's inheritance. What was mine stayed mine. Second, a clause that Patricia called an interference provision. If either party's family engaged in documented patterns of psychological pressure, financial manipulation, or deliberate spousal alienation, and if those patterns could be substantiated with evidence, the affected spouse was entitled to a structured settlement drawn from the marital assets. Not the family trust. The marital assets that we would build together. I thought about my notes document on my laptop. 18 months of dated entries. Names, quotes, contexts. I told Patricia I had documentation. She looked at me for a long moment. "How thorough, civil engineering thorough," I said. She smiled for the first time since I'd walked in. Third, a beneficiary clause tied to my father's trust. If the trust transferred to me during the marriage, as it was scheduled to do when I turned 32, those assets and any growth on them remained entirely mine regardless of marital outcome. The amendments were drafted, reviewed, notarized, and attached as a sealed addendum to the original Ashford document. Patricia sent the full package to the Ashford family's attorney with a cover letter. He reviewed it. He had 2 minor objections. Patricia addressed them. He signed off. Nobody called me directly about it, which told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly any of them had read it. The week before the signing, Eleanor took Daniel to lunch alone. He came home quieter than usual. "She's worried about the future," he said. "She wants to make sure everyone is protected." "The prenup protects everyone," I said. He nodded slowly. "She also said," he paused, "she said she hopes you understand that the family has a legacy to consider." I was standing at the kitchen counter making tea. I kept my back to him for 3 full seconds before I turned around. "I understand exactly what the family has to consider," I said. He looked at me like he wanted to say something else. I handed him his tea. "I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever been in a room where you knew something that everyone around you was about to discover and you had to hold your face completely still, you know what the next 4 days felt like. Stay with me, because what happened in that conference room is the part that still plays in my mind like a film I've watched 40 times. The signing was on a Saturday morning in October. Gray sky outside, the kind that sits low and flat over the lake. The conference room was on the 3rd floor of Robert's firm. Dark wood table, leather chairs, a credenza with a coffee service nobody touched. The windows faced the water. Patricia sat beside me in a charcoal blazer, her briefcase open, her hands folded on the table. Eleanor arrived in cream and pearls. She kissed Daniel on both cheeks and glanced at Patricia the way you glance at someone else's car in your parking space briefly, without acknowledgement. Robert sat at the head of the table. The Ashford family attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, arranged the documents into neat stacks. 2 paralegals flanked him. I counted 7 people in the room. Gerald began with the formalities. He explained the structure of the document, the intent, the mutual protections. His voice was practiced and even, the voice of a man who had read prenuptial agreements in conference rooms for 20 years without once being surprised by what happened next. He got to the asset protection clauses for Daniel's trust holdings. Eleanor lifted her champagne glass. This was when she said, "To protecting what matters." Gerald paused, smiled politely, continued. He was on page 3. Daniel signed where indicated. Gerald slid the document to me. I signed. Eleanor touched Robert's arm. Something passed between them, a look, a small exhale. I had been right about something. They had not read the amendments. Patricia had not moved. Her hands were still folded. She was watching Gerald. Gerald turned the page. He turned it again, and then he reached the addendum. I watched him read the first paragraph. I watched his eyes move across the second. I watched something change in his posture, barely perceptible, a slight straightening, the way a person adjusts when they realize the document in their hands is not the document they expected to be holding. He cleared his throat. "There is a sealed addendum filed with this agreement," he said, "reviewed and approved by both parties' counsel, dated September 14th. Robert looked up. "What addendum?" "The mutual asset disclosure and amendment clauses." Gerald looked at Patricia. "Your amendments." Patricia nodded. "What amendments?" Eleanor's voice was still light, still social, the voice she used when she was managing a situation she hadn't yet decided was serious. Gerald began reading. He read the asset disclosure section first. He read my name. He read the trust value. He read the property transfer. He read the investment portfolio summary. $3. 8 millions. The room was quiet. Eleanor put her champagne glass down. I watched her do the math. I watched it move across her face the way weather moves across flat water, first a stillness, then a ripple, then something that couldn't be called a smile anymore. Gerald kept reading. He got to the interference provision. He read the clause carefully, the legal language precise and unambiguous. Documented patterns of psychological pressure, financial manipulation, deliberate spousal alienation, substantiated with evidence. Robert leaned forward. "What does that mean, substantiated with evidence?" Patricia reached into her briefcase. She placed a bound document on the table. 63 pages. Dated entries from the first dinner in Grosse Pointe through the previous Tuesday. Names. Direct quotes. Contexts. The current girlfriend, the phone call, the lunch, the legacy comment. Every entry formatted with the precision of someone who designs load-bearing structures for a living and understands that what holds weight must be documented correctly. "It means," Patricia said, "that we have it." The room was very quiet. Gerald was still holding the addendum. Eleanor looked at Daniel. Daniel was looking at the 63 pages on the table. He didn't look at his mother. Robert cleared his throat. "Gerald, the addendum was reviewed and signed off by your office," Patricia said. "September 19th. The signature is on the last page." Gerald turned to the last page. His own signature. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I counted them. Then Eleanor said, "This is," and stopped. She started again. "This is not what we agreed to." Patricia's voice was the same temperature it had been since she sat down. "With respect, Mrs. Ashford, your attorney reviewed and approved every clause in this document. The mutual asset disclosure was a standard addition, given that a full financial picture had not been requested from my client. The interference provision was a reasonable protective measure given the documented interactions. Both were properly submitted, reviewed, and cleared." She paused. If there was a misunderstanding about what was in the document, that is a conversation for you and Mr. Foss. Gerald set the papers down very carefully on the table. Eleanor turned to me. For the first time since that first dinner in Grosse Pointe, she looked at me with something other than assessment. Something had shifted behind her eyes, the thing that happens when a person realizes they have been quietly and completely prepared for. You planned this, she said. I picked up my copy of the signed document. I squared the pages against the table. I slid them into the folder Patricia held open. I planned for my future, I said, which is what you told me a prenup was for. I want to tell you what happened after. Not because it ends with a dramatic confrontation or a single moment where everything changes. It ends the way most real things end, slowly, and in ways that take months to fully see. Daniel and I married 3 weeks later. Small ceremony, 40 people. My father walked me down the aisle in a suit he'd bought for the occasion and pressed my hand at the altar before he stepped back. And I thought about the yellow legal pad and the Coleman cooler and all the years of being quiet for exactly this reason. Eleanor did not attend the wedding. She told Daniel she had a prior commitment in Palm Beach. He didn't argue. I noticed that too. The first year of our marriage was, in many ways, the best year I can describe. Without Eleanor's presence in every room, Daniel was different, lighter. The man I had met at that conference in Chicago, curious and genuine, had more space to exist. We had disagreements. We navigated them. We built something real. The interference provision was never triggered. I kept the notes document on my laptop, still named Work Admin. I didn't add to it. I didn't delete it. Robert called Daniel 4 months after the wedding. I don't know everything they said. Daniel told me afterward that Robert had asked whether there was any possibility of revisiting certain terms in the prenup. Daniel told him no. He came home that evening and sat down at the kitchen table with a long exhale. I had no idea about your father's trust, he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was something closer to wonder. You never asked, I said. He was quiet for a moment. My family assumed. I know what your family assumed. He nodded. He looked at the table. I'm sorry they made you feel like you needed to protect yourself before you even married me. I looked at him. I protect myself always, I said. That's not about you. That's about me. He understood. My father turned 63 the following April. We drove up to Saginaw for his birthday. He made hamburgers on the grill in the backyard. He wore the same Michigan State cap he'd worn since I was in middle school. After dinner, he and Daniel sat on the back steps and talked for 2 hours about load-bearing soil composition and why the 1990s were the worst decade for residential construction in the Midwest. My father called me the next morning. He's all right, he said. Coming from Ray Whitmore, that was a standing ovation. Eleanor and I have been in the same room 6 times since the wedding. She is unfailingly polite. She has never once mentioned the prenup. I have never brought it up. There is an understanding between us now, unspoken, precise, and permanent. She knows what I documented. She knows what I prepared. She knows that the woman she assessed at that first dinner in Grosse Pointe and found wanting had spent 18 months writing down every word she said. Quiet is not the same as absent. Prepared is not the same as aggressive. And a document filed at the right time, in the right office, reviewed and signed by the right people, doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be accurate. My father's trust transferred to me on my 32nd birthday. Patricia handled the paperwork. It took 11 days. Daniel and I opened a joint account for household expenses and kept everything else exactly where it had always been, separate, documented, and protected. The Coleman cooler is still behind the passenger seat of Dad's Silverado. He bought a new truck last year, his first in 14 years, and he moved the cooler into it the same day. Some things don't need to change just because you can afford to change them. My father taught me that the people who announce their worth the loudest are usually the ones with the least to protect. He also taught me that the people worth trusting are the ones who hand you a key before you know you'll need a door. I signed that prenup on a Saturday morning in October while Eleanor raised her glass and smiled at her son. The lawyer hadn't finished reading. She should have waited. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who has ever been underestimated by the people sitting across the table from them. Drop a comment. Have you ever prepared for a moment you hoped would never come? I read every one. Subscribe so the next story finds you. I'll see you there.